Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. When I was 3 years old, my dad was a pastor of a small church in a community called Grassy Lake, Alberta. I had a 2-year-old sister and a 1-year-old sister. We were a young family. My dad was born in Germany, and so I wasn't surprised that the missions agency of our denomination contacted him and asked whether or not he and my mom and our young family, if we would consider moving to Germany to pastor a fledgling faith community that had just come into being. And so they talked about it and came to the conclusion that they would. And so we packed all of our belongings. I don't have much of a memory of that, but I do remember some things in those early years because we arrived in Germany, I as a 3-year-old, and one of the first things that happened is that we had to report for some medical examinations because we were moving into this country. And what they discovered was that my mom and I were diagnosed with tuberculosis, TB. And so my parents were confronted by an interesting choice. They could decide to just get onto the next plane and fly right back to Canada and find another opportunity of some kind, or they could decide that the call on their life, the notion that they would serve in this small church that had just come to be, was a promise that they would keep. And so they decided to stay. And what this meant is that my mom, as an adult, went to an adult facility where she was quarantined for a 3-month period. And I, as a 3-year-old, was sent to a place for children. And I was to be there for 6 months. I still remember the day. I didn't understand it, but my parents got me ready. We went on this road trip. We drove to this location. I was not with my sisters. It was just them and I. There was a suitcase with my belongings. They brought me to this place. We sat in an office. We sat across the desk from a doctor who was speaking with my parents, and while this conversation was unfolding, a nurse walked into the room, and she picked me up, and she picked up my little suitcase, and she carried me out of the room. The image remains with me. Because as she was walking down the hall, I was up over her shoulder, and I saw the door fall closed. I did not see my parents again for 6 months, with one exception. On my birthday, which was in the middle of August, they came and they picked me up and they took me to a local playground, and I don't know what I did. I assume I was on the swings, perhaps tried out the slide a few times, and then they returned me to this place. This is the beginning of the resume of hardship, suffering, and bad things that I can name in my life. Those are my earliest memories where I became aware that I was living in a world that I didn't understand, but certainly there were some things about it that were not good. These are things that I did not enjoy, I did not take pleasure in them. What is your resume of hardship, suffering, and bad things that have happened in your life? Perhaps as I've shared mine, some things have come to your minds. We're in a series called The Anatomy of the Soul. And it seems appropriate for us to explore the theme of suffering as it relates to our soul. And so we begin with a diagram that has helped us understand that the soul is not just a little invisible component of our life. It's not just a little centerpiece that has some kind of eternal value, but rather that our soul encompasses our totality of existence. It starts with our will, our spirit, sometimes referred to as our hearts at the center. It's quite weak, but it exists. It's part of our circumstances. And then it moves on into our minds. We have minds where we find our thoughts and our feelings. And as John has been reminding us over the last number of Sundays, every thought has a feeling. Every feeling has a thought. This is where we experience deep things. Then we have a body. There's a physical presence that we have in this lifetime. This is a place where we experience habits. Some of the addictions that draw us in. Our body is a stubborn thing. If you've ever tried to introduce an exercise routine, or if you want to change your diet, you've discovered how hard it is to persuade your body to assume some new ways of engaging. But this is part of our soul. And then in addition to that, there is a relationship presence that we have, because of course we don't live in isolation. We live in a community. There's other people that we bump into, and this is also part of our soul, how we express relationship with those people around us. This is the entirety of our soul. It is a complex part of us. It's the complex totality of us, as opposed to just a little central thing. So even as you look at these components of our soul, you discover very quickly that when we experience suffering and hardship, it strikes us in deep places. We talk about the dark night of the soul. We talk about the difficulties and how the question really is it well with our soul or not? So how do we put context around this reality of suffering? And I will tell you, I want to share some thoughts with you that I hope will be helpful to us. And the person I want to give credit to is a man by the name of Gary Friesen, who wrote a doctoral thesis on this whole subject. And I have enjoyed his insights incredibly, and I want to share those with you. Perhaps they'll become very helpful to you also. Gary Friesen introduces to us the concept of a sovereign will of God, which is represented by this circle. The sovereign will of God contains all activities that have been and all the activities that will be. It literally contains the whole of all the things that we as humans are up to in this creation that He has created. It is elusive to us. It's mostly hidden. If you want to understand the sovereign will of God, you literally have to look at yesterday. The things that were part of the world yesterday, the things that transpired yesterday, represent this part. It includes not only the good things, but it also includes the bad things that are part of our experience as humans on earth. The sovereign will of God contains all of that. And then there's another part, and that is the moral will of God. This is the part that we actually look for all the time, because we wrestle with the notion of God being a good God and allowing bad things to happen. Where is the good of God in light of our experience in this lifetime? Well, the moral will of God represents that. It is entirely known to us. It's given to us in something that we call the Bible. It's given to us in the content of a series of stories of humans who have written about their encounters with God, including the first 4 books of the New Testament, which are the Gospels, as we call them, and they tell the story of Jesus. And when Jesus teaches in those moments, He teaches His disciples, we listen to the instructions that He gives them, and we understand that not only are they good for those people at that time, but there's learning for us also that we can apply these same truths in our life. And so we treat the Bible as the understanding of what it is that God would like our life to be all about and like. This is given to us in its entirety. There is no moment in the future where we have to fear that perhaps at the end of our life, as we encounter God, He may say to us, well, listen, you did quite well, but there's these few things I didn't tell you about, and in those you get a failing grade. There's no such thing. We've been given all of the information that we need. God's moral will is entirely revealed to us, for us to live the kind of life that we can imagine. And so here are the distinctions of these two things. So I want to explore this with you as we look at some very specific circumstances to see how this actually plays out. So we turn to Hebrews chapter 5. We have this interesting set of verses that I want to walk us through. It says this: during the days of Jesus' life on earth, so understand His humanity in this, He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save Him from death. We know that Jesus' pattern was to speak with His Father constantly. He had rhythms of doing that, and He would turn to Him. And there's a particular moment the night before He was arrested for His crucifixion where He's praying to God and He's saying to Him, please, I need you to prevent the suffering that's on the near horizon for me. Would you please consider doing that? And here the verse goes on to say, and He was heard because of His reverent submission. So far, this is really good news. Jesus is praying to His Father, and His Father clearly heard Him. But then something interesting happens. Son though He was, He learned obedience from what He suffered. And once made perfect, a better translation of that word really is once He completed His assignment, here on earth. He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him and was designated by God to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. That simply means that Jesus became an intercessor between humans and God, which is the role of a priest. And Melchizedek is an Old Testament priest that you could read about if you want to explore further. But here's the point of this passage. Jesus experienced suffering as part of his time here on earth. This is a reality that God the Father did not, in fact, protect him from and did not prevent him from experiencing. Now, we wrestle with this a little bit because what is with this? This, again, violates our understanding of a good God. How could he allow this? And this is where I'll tell you that the understanding of the sovereign will of God and the moral will of God is very helpful to us. Because if the sovereign will of God, in fact, includes all the good but also the bad things, it's like the entirety of it, then suddenly what happens is we understand that the suffering that we experience in this life is not outside of God's control. It's not something he's not aware of. It's not like he's turned his head and he's just averting his eyes to not see it. He's fully aware of what's happened. And we ask ourselves the question, well, why? Why is this part of our experience? And this is where his design of free will comes into play. You see, when he created this world and he placed humans into his creation, he said to them, one of the things that's really important to me is that you have freedom of choice. I want to make sure that you get to decide whether or not you want to be in relationship with me. And in releasing that, he experienced what we experience as parents. If you're an adult that provides care for anyone else, you understand the weight of this. And that is that as much as you would wish to protect people from harm. You want to help people to make the best decisions that they can, but at some point you release them into their own autonomy and their own decision-making capacity, and you realize that they have the choice to make bad choices, which then will lead to, well, harmful things, suffering. Or they're subject to the decisions of other humans around them, which means that this world is not a safe place, and so suffering is likely the outcome. But this is part of the big picture of how the sovereign will of God plays out. So let me look at the diagram again. So we have 4 areas. We have area number 1, which is the sovereign will of God, which I've said to you, it captures all of it. It captures all of the activity, both the good and the bad. Then we have area number 2, and this is the overlap between the God's sovereign will and God's moral will. And this is a curiosity. Every once in a while we have a glimpse of this. Because what this area represents is a time when we make decisions that are in line with God's moral will, because they unfold they're part of God's sovereign will. And just for a moment, we're expressing the way it was meant to be. There is an instruction we've received. There is a certain direction that we've received, and we're acting on it. So if you've ever seen the evidence of a kind of love that you would almost imagine impossible for humans to express to one another, if you've experienced or perhaps been the giver of the kind of forgiveness that is literally elusive because you think, how could anyone be able to forgive in this moment? If you ever see something that is of that kind of grandeur, you discover that we're getting a glimpse of what eternity will be like. We're getting a glimpse of what the thing could really be if it looked the way God had intended for it in the first place. And when we see that, we're encouraged by the evidence of something that is much greater, and it's impactful to us. It blesses us to see this. Area number 3 is part of the moral will of God, but it's not in the sovereign will of God. In other words, this is stuff that does not happen. The moral will of God is this. And this is where freedom of choice grows to almost a devastating truth. Because it's not just about us choosing to follow the instructions we've received and doing those well, but we have, in our freedom of choice, actually been left with a decision to either choose to follow God or choose not to follow him. God's moral will would be that everybody in all of creation, all of humanity would choose him by free will, would wish to embrace what he offers. And yet, because he shows such restraint, he gives away the responsibility, he gives away the opportunity for us to choose for or against him. And so there's an area number 3, there's a longing that God has which will not come to be because there will be people who will decide because they have the capacity to decide that they will decide not to follow him. And then there's area number 4. Area number 4 is one of the encouragements of this diagram for me to understand this, because here it is. It's outside of the moral will of God, so it's certainly something that's not good. But it's also outside of this diagram, so in other words, it won't happen. And so what this represents is the evil that does not happen. So let me explain this way. When you find yourself in difficult circumstances, whatever suffering or hardship or bad thing you want to name, in the midst of that, you often feel like this is the worst. You can't imagine something even worse. It's like this is the most devastating thing. I'm just at the end of myself. And yet, if you take a sober look, and I'm not suggesting that you do this right in the midst of such a situation, but certainly in reflection later on, you discover, you know what? The truth is that we could easily, in every situation that is really bad, imagine something worse yet. And this in some ways represents for me the reality that God, who is in fact watching all of this and observing all of this, that he does place limits. Where has he, and we wouldn't know about this, where has he put limits in place where he says, no, that evil I will not allow to happen. That will not be part of the experience. Where does he, in fact, where has he intervened and protected us from something that's even worse than what we experience in our life? And so this has been helpful. In Romans chapter 5, we can explore this a little bit further. So here are some verses for us to consider as we explore this. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into his grace, in which we now stand, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. So this is an incredibly powerful, very encouraging text. It affirms for us that Jesus, in fact, came, that he endured the suffering of crucifixion, that he, in fact, died, and he rose from the dead. And all of this made it possible, created a line of communication between Father God and humanity. And this is the thing that's captured here by the writer of Romans chapter 5. And all of this is very much filled with hope, and it sounds really excellent. And then this happens. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Do you see how the author of Romans is clearly saying to us, suffering is part of the picture. So we have to name the reality of suffering, that it is part of the picture. We cannot avoid it. It's part of the human condition. If there was a brochure for humanity, this would be one of its features. But in the midst of this, for us to understand that suffering does in fact play a role, that there is something here that happens when we experience suffering that shapes our character. And there is, my friends, no other school for character building than suffering. The only way that you and I build our character, the only way our character is shaped, is by the school of hard knocks. There is no other way that this comes about. Now, I do want to say this, though. I am deeply troubled by the callousness of saying, while suffering plays this purpose for us to learn something. Because I will tell you that I'm aware of stories, I've certainly heard stories of people, and their circumstances that they describe are so devastating and heart-wrenching. And perhaps this is your story. It seems to me that sometimes we pay too high a price for the learning. And I cannot just say, well, there's some learning in this. And of course, the craziness in our humanities, what do? Our learning that we pursue in every instance of suffering is, what's the meaning of this? Why am I suffering this particular thing? But that's not the pursuit. That's not where the learning lies. The learning actually lies more in what is true of our relationship with God. That's the character-building element of this. But I do not wish for you to hear that our suffering can be easily dismissed because it's the learning opportunity, and we should be grateful for it. Because that's not the way it works in my heart. When I see that kind of suffering, I am deeply troubled by it. But the truth of the matter is, it is part of our experience, and there can be a learning that comes out of it, as Romans chapter 5 suggests. So let's explore this a little bit further. There's an interesting passage in Galatians chapter 5. I don't know if you're noticing the pattern. Please do not read a deep theological thread into this. We're looking at Hebrews chapter 5, and Romans chapter 5, and now Galatians chapter 5. It comes to me out of the resources that were given to me in order to prepare for this morning, and I seized the opportunity. For those of you that are writing notes, this is actually quite helpful, because you only have to write 5 once, if you like. But the point is, the authors of these scriptures did not have chapter and verse divisions. I don't think you do that in your emails or your letters that you write. They didn't either. They were assigned later on for usefulness. But there's something curious about this chapter 5 thing. And so here it is out of Galatians chapter 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, or patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I read this list as you do, and we think to ourselves, this is the kind of thing we experience when we're in the midst of the best of life, when it's all like sweet stuff and it's good things going on. This is when like the sun is shining and the snow isn't blowing around the corners of our buildings. This is the good in it. But what if we explore the fruit of the Spirit, not just for the good times, but what if you consider this in the dark times? So let's apply it to the crucifixion of Jesus for a moment. So picture it. The cross is lying on the ground. Jesus is brought over to the cross. There are people who are preparing nails and hammers. Devastating. Suffering. Bad things. Does the fruit of the Spirit apply? Is there love? Oh, yes, there's love. Scripture doesn't give us any reference to the fact that Jesus struggled. There's nothing in the way he's described. In fact, he's described as being a lamb led to slaughter. He went willingly to that cross, and he laid down on this cross. And he offered his wrists and his feet, and he drove nails through these things. So where is the love? Well, I could tell you that Jesus was absolutely convinced about his mission. He knew that this was a way for him to express his unconditional love for us. There was love in play. In fact, love kept him on that cross. But there was another kind of love. Imagine for a moment, if God's sovereign will includes suffering, how much restraint he must have to show in order for the circumstances, the reality of our free will to play out. How often would he want to interfere? How often would he want to step in and say, no, I think I'll stop that from happening? And now he's watching his son be crucified. Can you imagine the restraint? His love for his son is now in tension with his love for all humanity, knowing full well this awful thing, which does not belong in the moral will of God, it can only find its place in the sovereign will of God, has to come to be. How did he manage to suppress his desire to want to rescue his son in that moment? And he lets this unfold as it needed to. Why? Because his love for humanity overruled the desire to stop the sacrifice of his son. He knew that this was required. Love was present. Was joy present? I doubt it. Was peace present? No way. Was patience present? Well, perhaps Jesus had to be patient. Was kindness present? Jesus is found to be praying for those who are driving the nails in his wrist, saying, God, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Even in that moment, he's other-minded. It's almost impossible to imagine. Goodness, we are experiencing the goodness of this truth. Faithfulness, he was faithful. Gentleness, well, he just let this happen. Self-control, did he show the same kind of resistance or the restraint that his father was showing? Is it possible that in the midst of our darkest moments, the fruit of the Spirit could be in play? That in the midst of our suffering, we don't have to literally think it's just all lost, but rather there's still something powerful at work because the fruit of the Spirit could come and still find expression in this. I thought we should look at a psalm. Any guesses as to which psalm? 5. Psalm 5. There's more learning. Listen to my words, Lord. Consider my lament. Hear my cry for help, my King and my God. For to you I pray. David is the author of this. He's writing and he's saying, I turn to God. My confidence remains in God. I turn to him. Consider my lament tells us that he's in the middle of a dark moment. In the morning, Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning, I lay my requests before you and wait expectantly. Notice that what he's speaking of here is a pattern to say, I pursue relationship with you. This is important to me. I turn to you because you're the sovereign one. I turn to you and I wait expectantly for your inputs. So here's some learnings for us. Suffering is real. Suffering happens with God observing it. He sees it. We are to learn from it. Our character is shaped by it, and I want to be careful when I say that. And now what we're learning is that in the midst of our suffering, we can turn to God and we can have an expectation that He would have something for us, and that, like this author is explaining to us, perhaps there's an opportunity for us to say, what are we doing? What are you and I doing today to prepare for the next suffering that's just around the corner? How are we preparing ourselves so that we're strong when it comes? And the psalm goes on. It says this, "For you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness." Notice more learning. As much as God is aware and as much as the suffering and the bad stuff that happens is contained within His sovereign will, please don't ever believe for a moment that He's pleased and somehow satisfied or takes satisfaction and pleasure in His suffering. He's as offended by the suffering we experience as we are. He is as troubled by this as we are. And He knows this is part of the condition that He's created, but He struggles with it as we do. Listen to the words. "You are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. With you, evil people are not welcome. The arrogant cannot stand in your presence. You hate all who do wrong. You destroy those who tell lies. The bloodthirsty and deceitful you, Lord, detest." Let there be no mistake about the fact that as much as suffering is part of our experience, that God is not pleased with it. He's not just resigned to it. He doesn't just turn His face away from it so He doesn't have to see it. He's as troubled by it as you and I. The psalm goes on. "But I, by your great love, can come into your house. In reverence I bow down toward your holy temple. Lead me, Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me." Notice the good news in the midst of the dark. The confidence in God remains for this author, David, King David. Very important person. And here he goes. "Not a word from their mouth can be trusted." Back to the dark. "The heart is filled with malice." Here is a powerful line to discover or maybe to describe the horrific sense of suffering and malice that we experience. "Their throat is an open grave." Incredibly powerful. "Declare them, with their tongues they tell lies. Declare them guilty, O God. Let their intrigues be their downfall. Banish them for their many sins, for they have rebelled against you." Is there any doubt that the things that David is describing here are bad things and that God takes no pleasure in those? Psalm 5 carries on. "But let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them, that those who love your name and may rejoice in you. Surely, Lord, you bless the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield." Suffering is real, my friends. It's happening, and God is aware of it. He's as troubled by it as you and I are. There is a learning in it, but we shouldn't offer that callously, because sometimes the learning that we make, we'd rather give up on that to avoid the suffering that we've had to endure. At the end of the day, I think for us to accept the circumstances, the realities, but to lean on the promises that God continues to make, that He will be present with us in the midst of our things, allow us to, even in the most difficult circumstances, to say, "It is well with my soul." What are you and I doing today to ensure that in the future that would be true of us? How are we investing in a relationship with Him so that could be true of us?
Thank you so much for your teach today. I know it's not an easy subject. It's something that brings up a lot of emotion. And I just want to thank you for leaning into that.
You're welcome.
So I got a question for you here. Well, quite a few questions came in. But here's the first one. Bob, you shared about your first memory of realizing suffering. But for me, it's not where it starts. It's that it never seems to end. How do we find relief from suffering, particularly emotional suffering, that simply will not go away?
Yeah. First of all, let me say, I'm so sorry. One of the dangers in teaching on suffering is that you may speak words that are not meant to be callous and dismissive, and yet I'm aware of stories of people whose lives are just so filled with that kind of suffering that it doesn't seem to end. And I would say to you that there are practical choices for you to make. Please don't seek isolation. Don't remove yourself from life circumstances. It is difficult when you've experienced such ongoing pain to trust and to take the risk of once again investing in a relationship because perhaps you've experienced disappointment there too, and people have let you down. But to not give up and to rather say, no, I was made for community, and to lean in. Are there people, is there a person that you could share with and simply say, would you walk this road with me so you don't have to do it alone? I would encourage you to seek community and not to withdraw. The other thing I would say is that we often have the impression, and the illustration is like this: if I find myself in the swamp, and I have this impression that there's solid ground ahead. It may be in the distance, it may be hard to see, but it's there. And we picture Jesus standing on the shore, and he's beckoning us over and saying, like, come this way, and yet here we are in the muck and mire of life. This is the false image. Jesus joins us. He's in the muck and mire with you. The suffering you're experiencing is also his suffering. He's not oblivious to it. He's feeling your pain together with you. You're not alone in this. He is with you. And you can turn to him. He experienced the full realm of what it meant to be human. He's compassionate, not out of ignorance, but out of fully knowing what it means. And so lean on his promises. Read in Scripture the things that he wants to assure you of. And I hope that those words will be reassuring when you're on your own. But for you to seek community where other people can speak some of his promises into your life, there will be a glimpse of light in your life. That would be my hope.
Next question. Does everything happen for a reason for a follower of God?
I would say that if we have this impression that God in his wisdom has designed a very specific slot for each and every one of our lives, I think we will be disappointed. The line is this: don't mistake the edge of your horizon as sorry, I got that wrong. Bottom line is, I'm not going to get that quote right, I'm sorry about that, because it's a powerful line. But no, there isn't a slot into which we fall, and all the things that we experience are specifically ordained by God. When you look at the diagram, the overlap of the sovereign will and the moral will of God, there is freedom, there's a lot of room. So for example, I'm not going to find a verse in the Bible that says, Robert Marsch, you're going to be a pastor of the meeting place. So I would say to you, well, why is it that I'm a pastor of the meeting place? Well, there are other contributing factors, but I can't turn to his moral will to direct me specifically. Could I be a pastor of another church? Well, sure. When I was a youth pastor, high school students would come to me and would say, I'm thinking after high school, I want to go to Bible school, but I've been praying to God and he's entirely silent about which Bible school I should go to. And I say to them, excuse me for a moment. You're prepared to set aside a few months or a year of your life to give to a pursuit of paying attention to God in that time. Before you get into your career, before you get into your educational track, you're going to do this. Do you like skiing? Go to Austria and enjoy the Bible school there. God will meet you there. You like it hot? Go to YWAM somewhere in Australia. You have lots of freedom. You and I, we have lots of freedom. So as far as this is concerned, does everything happen for a reason? Yes, I would say it fits into the bigger picture, but if you're looking to wrestle down every specific reason for every decision and every circumstance that comes to be, you will be disappointed, because God does not operate in that kind of attention to detail if he wants something specific. And the Bible is clear. If you ever encounter an angel, and the angel says, do this, just do it. But if you and I are expecting an angel to show up in every decision we make, we're going to be disappointed, because that's not the way it works. That's special revelation. So I don't know if that answers the question, but to wrestle out the reason for everything that happens because I'm a Christ follower, I don't think it's helpful for me to understand the purpose, whatever. I know that he has the big picture in mind. I know he has an end in mind, and we will experience that end at some point. It's out of our knowledge, and that's fine.
Bobby spoke about the suffering being the result of free wills choosing against the moral and sovereign will of God. But what about tsunamis, earthquakes, and volcanoes? Why doesn't God put an end to those kinds of suffering?
Yeah. I've asked myself the same question. The thing is, if we got together and established a committee to prepare a proposal to lay at God's feet and say, these are the things we would like you to prevent, and these are the things that we're happy to receive, I think we'd have a hard time agreeing on what those are. There is a curiosity about this in it for me. I think the illustration I'd like to use is a forest fire. For a very long time, we tried to do everything we could to prevent forest fires until people who really took a look at this discovered that forest fires are a natural part of the restoration of a forest. And so what happened is we changed the conditions of the forest fire. It was no longer a threat, but it was seen as a necessary thing. The fact that we build in forests, that we choose to live in such places, means that we're taking a risk in the freedom of our choice to subject ourselves to that. Now, that doesn't explain tsunamis, but they do happen because the natural order of things, because of creation, the way it unfolds, there will be earthquakes, there will be those kinds of circumstances that happen that cause these things to happen. God is not absent, but he's also decided not to micromanage the planet. He's not in control of all these things. He's not saying, today I will send this earthquake. He's literally saying, I've created the world, and because of the way creation unfolds, and this is related to the poor choice that Adam and Eve made, that creation is now sort of on a decline, if you want. It is no longer this beautiful environment that God had envisioned for it to be. It includes these threatening realities. And yes, hundreds of thousands of people die. And you and I have really only one response in those circumstances, and that is to do the very best we can to express compassion in those moments. It's not those people's fault. There's nothing we can do technologically to prevent a tsunami, but we can respond with compassion, exercise the fruit of the Spirit in those moments as they come. And that's the only way that we can make any difference in those circumstances, and they are devastating. And again, my heart breaks, but his heart breaks too.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Paul.
So our first question goes like this. Bob, I understand that God cannot give us free will without an opportunity for suffering. Area 1 on the Venn diagram. But if God can still occasionally put his foot down and stop suffering, area 4, why wouldn't God put his foot down more often?
Yeah. Oh, it's part of my prayer also. How often have I prayed and asked that God would intervene in a very particular way because there's something that I just cannot stand the thought of that could happen. I would say to you, if we were to get together and talk about like what kind of proposal we would want to assemble and then present to him in all submission, but at the same time say, God, these are the things that we would accept as far as suffering is concerned. These are things that are on the unacceptable side of things. I imagine we would have a hard time agreeing. But the bottom line is that I think there's nothing wrong with us saying to God, could you protect us from this? Could you prevent this harm from occurring? In fact, I would say a lot of our prayers that are other-minded, that we're praying for others when we're interceding on behalf of others, are along those lines. And I think it is entirely fair for us to express that longing. And I do believe, as he heard Jesus' request that night before his crucifixion, that he will hear us. And then for us to submit to how he's going to play this out, like what he will do about it. I think there's something about the submission of that, but at the end, I will never stop asking. I won't stop asking for good things either, and I think in both categories, I think we should just ask him, say, could you intervene? And perhaps he will do the 4, right? He will intervene in ways that we are not even aware of, but he's protected us from some things.
Next question. Why is sin and suffering necessary to grow character? It seems we need sin and suffering for us to grow. Does God really need sin to grow our character?
Yeah, you're asking all the good questions. Yeah. I would say, think about how much learning that we have done in our humanity. The first time I crashed my bike, I understood the dangers of riding a bike. It made me a little bit more cautious. It caused me to be a better bike rider. Or perhaps to choose better friends, because I was probably emulating some of their crazy stuff. But the point, though, is that learning comes to us by experiencing it, and some of the learning comes to us by experiencing good things, and some learning happens to us because of bad things. That seems to be an established element of what it means to be human. And so what I'm comforted by is the fact that the things that we experience that are not good, that I would identify as not good, that they are encompassed by God's sovereign will. I'm comforted, strangely comforted by the truth of that, but at the same time knowing that if I felt in that moment that he really was absent, that he had turned his back, and he wasn't even aware that this was happening, it would be devastating. The fact that he's part of it helps me to put it in the right context. Could there have been another way? When I read about what eternity is like, as far as what's written for us in Scripture, it doesn't seem that pain will be part of that experience. Will we continue to learn? I think there's going to be harp classes for everyone. And we're going to learn to fly and to polish the golden streets. I think there's some things that we're going to learn, but we won't learn them by suffering. I'm not trying to dismiss the significance of what's going on, but I think there's something about that that's intriguing to me.
Yeah, I often tell people, like when they sit with me pastorally, I often will use the expression that, oh, you can totally grow through contemplation, prayer, and stuff, but most people don't do that.
Yeah.
And for overwhelmingly, it does seem that suffering is our best teacher. Okay, this one is a quote and a question. The quote is from Bishop Desmond Tutu, and it says this: "For whatever reason, since mankind showed up on the scene, God does nothing without a willing human partner." Now here's the question. Do you think that God will return to us the question, and where were you in the midst of suffering?
Yes, I believe he will. I think there is something in observing the example of Jesus' life to realize that in the middle of this devastating experience in his world, that he remained aware of the role that he was playing for the sake of humanity. I think that other-mindedness, I think that's part of our picture also. And I would say to you that sometimes the suffering that I will name in my own life is diminished by my awareness that my suffering prompts me to be more compassionate to the people around me, or understand their suffering more, or to even be more gracious in accepting the truth of their suffering, and then for me to get engaged and to actually practically do something about that. It does, that other-mindedness sometimes helps me get out of my own circumstances, and perhaps somebody said this morning to me they were in a current state of pity party. Right, they were feeling sorry for their own circumstances, and being other-minded, I think, helps us out of that. And there's something about us joining God in that kind of reconciliation work that is incredibly powerful. That's area number 2, when there's this invitation for us to act and respond to our community and to the needs in our world in a way that are aligned with the instructions we receive from God, and just for those moments we catch a glimpse of the way it was meant to be, in when it was meant to be perfect, and what eternity we would like. So,
Thank you, Bob. Send us out.
thanks, Paul. There is only one hope, my friends. In a world that has been created and designed by God, in a world into which he has placed us with all of our freedom of decision, there is only one hope, and that remains to be him. You can pursue any other hope you want, but at the end of the day, his hope is the one that's sustaining us, because he's the one that understands the whole thing, and he has his hand in all of it, and he's seeing all of it. He sees your pain. He is offended at the suffering that you're experiencing, as you are offended by it also. But he's with us in this. I'll leave with this last illustration. We often have this impression that when we're in the muck and mire of life, that somewhere ahead there is solid ground, and Jesus is standing over there, and he's beckoning us to come this way, get out of the muck and mire, come join me on the solid ground over here. It's a false picture. The better picture is he's right beside us. He is also covered in the muck and mire of our life. He joins us there. He's not waiting for us on the solid ground. He wants to take us to solid ground, but he's going to get there with us. You are in this with him together. Know this hope. I hope it's true of your own convictions. I bless you as you engage this week. We'll see you next Sunday.